The year was 1987, and deep in the forests of northern Idaho, smoke was rising from a place that officially didn't exist. The bunker had been burning for 3 hours when locals spotted a figure emerging through the flames. He was carrying something, or someone, in his arms. What happened next would become one of those stories that gets whispered about in small towns, the kind that makes people uncomfortable because it challenges everything they thought they knew about their own government. This is a story about a man named James Wheeler, a place that was erased from every map, and a child who supposedly was never born. James Wheeler was 32 years old when he took the job that would change his life forever. He had served 8 years in the army, most of it doing maintenance work on classified equipment at various bases around the country. When he got out in 1985, he did what a lot of veterans did back then. He looked for work that paid well and didn't ask too many questions about what kept him up at night. The job posting was vague, something about facility management and security clearance required. The pay was almost double what he had been making, and the location was listed simply as rural Idaho. James had grown up in a small town in Montana, so the idea of going back to that kind of quiet life appealed to him. He interviewed 3 times, each interview stranger than the last. They asked him about his family, his friends, his habits. They wanted to know if he had any strong political beliefs, if he attended church regularly, if he had ever talked to journalists. By the 3rd interview, James started to understand that this wasn't going to be a normal job, but he needed the money, and honestly, part of him was curious. When they finally offered him the position, they made him sign more paperwork than he had signed in his entire military career. Non-disclosure agreements, security clearances, documents that basically said he couldn't tell anyone where he worked or what he did. Even his own mother only knew he had taken a job somewhere out west. The facility itself was buried in the Clearwater National Forest, accessible only by a single, unpaved road that didn't appear on any map. It looked like a ranger station from the outside, just a small wooden building with a few trucks parked nearby. But underneath that innocent exterior was something else entirely, a concrete bunker that went 3 levels deep into the mountain. James learned during his first week that the facility was part of a program nobody talked about, one of those Cold War projects that had somehow survived into the late 80s, even though the world was supposedly getting safer. His job was simple on paper: monitor the systems, make sure everything stayed running, report any problems. What they didn't tell him during the interviews was what those systems were actually monitoring. The first few months were uneventful, almost boring. James would arrive at the facility early in the morning, descend the metal staircase into the bunker, and spend his day checking gauges, recording numbers, and making sure the generators stayed online. There were 3 other people who worked there, all of them quiet types who didn't ask questions and didn't volunteer information. There was Margaret, a woman in her 50s who handled communications. There was Dr. Reeves, who James assumed was some kind of scientist, but who never explained exactly what he did. And there was Carl, a security guard who seemed to take his job very seriously, despite the fact that they were in the middle of nowhere, and nobody even knew the place existed. The facility had been built in the early 70s, back when the government was convinced that every forest in America needed a secret installation just in case the Soviets decided to invade. This particular bunker had been used for atmospheric testing, monitoring radiation levels, tracking weather patterns. At least that's what the old documents said, but James noticed things that didn't quite add up. There were rooms in the lowest level that stayed locked, areas that even he wasn't allowed to access, despite his security clearance. Sometimes he would hear sounds coming from down there, mechanical noises that didn't match anything he had been trained on. And then there were the supply deliveries. Every 2 weeks, a truck would arrive with food, equipment, and other materials. Most of it made sense, the kind of stuff you would expect at a remote facility. But every few months, there would be special deliveries that came at night. unmarked vans that would pull up to the bunker entrance, and men in suits would unload crates that got taken straight down to the restricted areas. James asked Margaret about it once, and she just gave him a look that said he should mind his own business. He learned to stop asking questions, but he couldn't stop noticing things. Like the fact that the power consumption for the facility was way higher than it should have been for a simple monitoring station. Or the way Dr. Reeves would sometimes emerge from the lower levels, looking exhausted and troubled, like he had just witnessed something he wished he hadn't. Everything changed in August of 1987. James had been working at the facility for almost 2 years by then, and he had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. But that month, something shifted. Dr. Reeves started spending more time in the restricted areas, sometimes staying down there for 12 or 14 hours at a stretch. Margaret seemed nervous, constantly on the phone with someone, speaking in hushed tones that James couldn't quite make out. Even Carl, who usually acted like nothing could faze him, started carrying his sidearm everywhere, even inside the bunker. James tried to go about his work as usual, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Then one evening, as he was preparing to head home for the day, he heard something he had never heard before. It was a child crying. The sound was faint, muffled by concrete and steel, but unmistakable. James froze at the bottom of the staircase, listening. The crying continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. He looked around, but he was alone in the corridor. Margaret had left an hour earlier, and Dr. Reeves was supposedly on the lowest level. Carl was up at the surface doing his rounds. James told himself he had imagined it. The bunker did strange things to sound, echoes bouncing off metal walls, the hum of machinery creating audio illusions. But deep down, he knew what he had heard. Over the next few days, he heard it again, always in the evening, always coming from somewhere below. He started paying closer attention to the restricted areas, to the locked doors that led deeper into the mountain. One of those doors had a small window, reinforced glass that was normally covered by a metal shutter. One evening, when everyone else was occupied, James carefully slid the shutter aside and looked through. What he saw made his blood run cold. The room beyond was set up like a medical facility, with equipment that looked more advanced than anything he had seen outside of a major hospital. And there, in the center of the room, was a child. A boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, lying on a bed and hooked up to various monitors. Dr. Reeves was there too, checking the equipment, making notes on a clipboard. The boy's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but he didn't move or make any sound. James quickly closed the shutter and backed away from the door. His hands were shaking. He didn't know what he had just witnessed, but every instinct told him it was something he wasn't supposed to see. James spent the next week trying to figure out what to do. He couldn't just ignore what he had seen, but he also knew that asking questions could cost him his job, or worse. The non-disclosure agreements he had signed were clear about the consequences of revealing classified information. He could face criminal charges, even imprisonment. But this was a child, a kid who looked sick and scared and completely alone in that underground room. James started doing some quiet investigating. He went through old files in the office, looking for any mention of the boy or what kind of program might involve keeping a child in a secret bunker. Most of the documents were heavily redacted, pages and pages of blacked-out text that told him nothing. But he did find one reference, buried in a report from 1985. It mentioned something called Project Clearwater, a continuation of earlier research into human resilience and adaptation. The details were vague, but the implications were disturbing. James also started paying closer attention to Dr. Reeves. The scientist was clearly struggling with something, drinking more than he should and looking increasingly haggard. One afternoon, James found him sitting alone in the break room, staring at his coffee cup like it held the answers to the universe. James sat down across from him and took a chance. He asked Dr. Reeves if everything was all right, if there was anything he wanted to talk about. For a moment, the scientist looked like he might actually open up. His eyes met James's, and there was a depth of guilt and sadness there that was almost overwhelming. But then he seemed to remember where they were and who might be listening. He stood up, mumbled something about getting back to work, and left the room. That night, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the boy, about what kind of research could possibly justify keeping a child locked underground. He thought about his own childhood, growing up free in Montana, exploring forests and fishing in streams. The idea that somewhere in America, a kid was being used for experiments in a facility that didn't officially exist, it made him sick. He decided that no matter what happened, he had to do something. He didn't know what yet, but he couldn't just walk away and pretend he hadn't seen anything. The opportunity came sooner than James expected, though not in any way he could have anticipated. It was a Wednesday afternoon in mid-September when the alarms started blaring. James was on the second level, doing routine maintenance on the ventilation system, when the entire bunker suddenly filled with flashing red lights and a deafening siren. His first thought was a fire drill, but they never did drills without advance notice. He grabbed the radio from his belt and called up to Carl at the surface. No response. He tried Margaret. Nothing. The radio was dead, just static. James ran toward the main corridor, following the emergency protocols he had been trained on. As he descended toward the lower level, he smelled smoke. Not the electrical burning smell of overheated wires, but actual smoke, thick and acrid. Something was seriously wrong. When he reached the lowest level, he saw flames coming from one of the mechanical rooms. The fire suppression system should have kicked in automatically, but nothing was happening. James realized with growing horror that someone had disabled the safety systems. This wasn't an accident. Through the smoke, he saw Dr. Reeves stumbling down the corridor, coughing and covering his mouth with his sleeve. The scientist grabbed James by the arm and pulled him close, shouting to be heard over the alarms. He said that the fire had started in the laboratory, that it was spreading fast, and that they needed to evacuate immediately. But James was already thinking about the boy. He asked Dr. Reeves about the child, about whether someone had gotten him out. The scientist's face went pale. He admitted that in the chaos, he had forgotten. The boy was still locked in the medical room, and there was no way to open the door remotely now that the power systems were failing. James didn't hesitate. He pushed past Dr. Reeves and ran toward the restricted area. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to see or breathe. He could feel the heat from the flames growing stronger, the fire feeding on oxygen and spreading through the ventilation system. The door to the medical room was sealed shut, requiring a key card and a code to open. James had neither, but he did have a fire axe from the emergency station. He swung the axe at the lock mechanism again and again, until the metal finally gave way. The door swung open, and James rushed inside. The boy was exactly where James had seen him before, lying on the bed and connected to monitors that were now beeping frantically as the power fluctuated. Up close, James could see how thin the child was, how pale his skin looked under the harsh fluorescent lights. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but he didn't cry out or struggle. It was like he had been taught not to make noise, not to react. James quickly disconnected the monitoring equipment, not knowing if he was hurting the boy or helping him, but knowing they didn't have time to be careful. He wrapped the child in a blanket and lifted him into his arms. The boy was light, too light for his age, like he hadn't been eating properly or exercising. As James turned to leave, he noticed a folder on the counter, thick with documents and photographs. Something made him grab it, stuffing it into his jacket even though every second counted. They made their way back through the smoke-filled corridors, James holding the boy tight against his chest and trying to shield him from the worst of the fumes. The heat was intense now, the fire spreading faster than James had thought possible. He could hear structural supports groaning under the stress, the concrete itself starting to crack from the temperature. When they reached the staircase to the surface, James found the way blocked. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, debris blocking the exit. He turned and ran the other way, toward the emergency escape tunnel that he had been shown during his initial orientation, but had never actually used. The tunnel was narrow and dark, designed for exactly this kind of situation, but terrifying to navigate while carrying a child and trying not to panic. James could hear explosions behind them now, probably fuel tanks or oxygen canisters going up as the fire reached the storage areas. The entire bunker was turning into a death trap. He pushed forward, his lungs burning from smoke inhalation, his arms aching from carrying the boy. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, sloping upward through the mountain. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, James saw light ahead. The emergency exit opened onto a hillside about half a mile from the main entrance, hidden behind a cluster of rocks and pine trees. James stumbled out into the fresh air, coughing violently and gasping for breath. He set the boy down gently on the grass and collapsed beside him, his whole body shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Behind them, smoke was pouring out of the tunnel entrance. In the distance, James could see the ranger station building that marked the main entrance to the bunker. Flames were shooting up from underground, and as he watched, the entire structure collapsed inward as the bunker beneath it gave way. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more forgotten tales of American heroes, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you these incredible stories that deserve to be told. James sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. The boy was alive, breathing normally now that they were out of the smoke. But he still hadn't said a word, just stared at James with those haunted eyes. James checked him over as best he could, looking for injuries or signs of distress. Apart from being underweight and clearly frightened, the boy seemed physically okay. As the adrenaline started to wear off, James began to think about what came next. He had just rescued a child from a classified government facility that was now burning to the ground. He had no idea if Margaret, Carl, or Dr. Reeves had made it out. He had no way to contact anyone, and his truck was parked near the main entrance, which was now completely inaccessible. The forest around them was quiet, just the sound of birds and wind in the trees. It was surreal, being in this peaceful place, while behind them a secret bunker was being consumed by fire. James retrieved the folder from his jacket and opened it. What he found inside made everything make sense in the worst possible way. The documents detailed Project Clearwater, which was exactly what James had feared. It was a continuation of research that had supposedly been shut down in the 70s, experiments designed to test human adaptation to extreme stress and isolation. The boy, whose name according to the files was Daniel, had been born in the facility. His mother had been a subject in an earlier phase of the project, though the documents didn't say what happened to her. Daniel had spent his entire life underground, part of a study examining how children developed when raised in completely controlled environments. The photographs showed Daniel at different ages, from infancy to his current state at 6 years old. In the early pictures, he looked like a normal baby, curious and alert. But as the years went on, something changed. His expressions became more withdrawn, his eyes losing that spark of childhood wonder. The most recent photos were the hardest to look at. James felt rage building in his chest as he read through the documents. This was an American child, born on American soil, who had been treated like a laboratory animal by his own government. No sunlight, no fresh air, no other children to play with. Just doctors and scientists studying his every response, documenting how isolation affected his growth and development. The project had been authorized under national security provisions, classified at the highest levels. According to the documents, Daniel didn't officially exist. No birth certificate, no social security number, no record anywhere that a child had been born in that bunker. The scientists had made sure of that. James knew he couldn't go to the authorities. The people who ran Project Clearwater were the authorities, or at least had enough power to make sure their secrets stayed buried. If he tried to expose what had happened, he would be arrested for violating national security laws, and Daniel would be taken back into custody, assuming he wasn't simply erased along with all evidence of the program. He needed help, but he didn't know who he could trust. As the sun started to set, James made a decision. He would hike out of the forest, avoiding roads and staying out of sight. He would take Daniel somewhere safe, somewhere far from Idaho and the people who might come looking. And he would figure out how to give this boy a real life, the childhood that had been stolen from him. They started walking, James carrying Daniel again when the boy got tired. It took them 2 days to make it out of the Clearwater National Forest, sleeping rough and surviving on stream water and the few supplies James had in his pockets. Daniel never complained, never asked where they were going or what was happening. It was like he had learned that questions were pointless, that adults would do what they wanted regardless. When they finally reached a small town on the edge of the forest, James used a payphone to call the only person he thought might understand. His former commanding officer, a man named Colonel Harrison, who had always struck James as someone who valued doing the right thing over following orders blindly. James explained as much as he could in a brief conversation, speaking in code and trying not to say anything that would get them both in trouble. Harrison listened without interrupting, then told James to stay where he was. 3 hours later, a car pulled up with 2 people inside. One was Harrison himself, now retired but still carrying that military bearing. The other was a woman named Patricia Chen, who Harrison introduced as a lawyer who specialized in cases involving government misconduct. They drove to a motel outside of town, and James told them everything. He showed them the documents, explained what he had seen in the bunker, described the fire and the rescue. Patricia recorded it all, taking notes and asking careful questions. When James finished, Harrison and Patricia exchanged a long look. Finally, Harrison spoke. He told James that what he had stumbled into was bigger than either of them had imagined. Project Clearwater was just one piece of a larger network of classified programs, some of which had been running since the 50s. There were people in very high places who had a vested interest in making sure none of this ever came to light. But Harrison also said that things were changing, that there were others in the government and military who were tired of the secrecy and the abuses. With the right approach and the right evidence, they might be able to force an investigation. Over the next several months, Patricia worked behind the scenes, building a case and finding allies in Congress who were willing to ask uncomfortable questions. James and Daniel stayed hidden, moving between safe houses and rarely staying in one place for more than a few weeks. During that time, James watched Daniel slowly start to come alive. The first time the boy saw the ocean, he stood on the beach for an hour, just staring at the waves like he couldn't believe something so vast and beautiful existed. The first time he tasted ice cream, his eyes went wide with surprise and delight. Small moments that most kids take for granted were revelations for Daniel, evidence of a world he had never known existed. James also worked with child psychologists who specialized in trauma, people who understood that Daniel needed careful, patient help to recover from what had been done to him. The boy started to talk more, though his vocabulary was strange, a mix of clinical terms from the scientists and childish wonder at everything new he encountered. He had nightmares most nights, waking up convinced he was back in the bunker. But slowly, gradually, he began to heal. The official story about the bunker fire was that it had been a tragic accident caused by faulty equipment. The government acknowledged that a classified facility had been destroyed, but claimed it was just a weather monitoring station. 3 employees were reported as casualties, including Dr. Reeves. James learned later that Margaret and Carl had actually survived, though both had been transferred to other positions and signed even more restrictive non-disclosure agreements. The truth about Project Clearwater and the boy who was never supposed to exist stayed buried, at least officially. But Patricia had been busy. She had contacted journalists, human rights organizations, and politicians who she thought could be trusted. She had made copies of the documents James had saved, distributing them to enough people that they couldn't all be silenced. In early 1988, a congressional committee announced they would be holding hearings into alleged misconduct at classified research facilities. They didn't mention Project Clearwater by name, but everyone involved knew what was really being investigated. James was subpoenaed to testify, which meant coming out of hiding and facing the very real possibility of prosecution. But he did it anyway, sitting in front of cameras and Congress members and telling them exactly what he had seen. He showed them the documents. He described the boy he had found locked in an underground room. He explained why he had broken every rule and law to save a child who wasn't supposed to exist. The hearings were contentious, with some members of Congress arguing that James was a criminal who had endangered national security, while others demanded to know why a child had been experimented on in a secret bunker. The testimony went on for weeks, with dozens of witnesses called to explain various aspects of classified research programs. Dr. Reeves, it turned out, had actually survived the fire. He appeared before the committee looking 20 years older than he was, his hands shaking as he confirmed everything James had said. He testified that he had been troubled by Project Clearwater from the beginning, but had convinced himself that the research was important, that the sacrifice of one child could lead to knowledge that might save thousands. But watching Daniel grow up in isolation, seeing the light fade from his eyes year after year, had broken something in Dr. Reeves. He admitted that he had started the fire himself, unable to continue with the experiment, but too afraid to simply walk away. He had hoped that destroying the facility would end the program and free Daniel, though he hadn't expected anyone to actually go back for the boy. His testimony was devastating, a senior scientist admitting to everything the government wanted to deny. In the end, the committee issued a report condemning the practices at Project Clearwater and several related programs. Reforms were promised, oversight was increased, and several officials were quietly forced into retirement. Nobody went to jail. The full extent of what had happened remained classified, protected by national security laws that were stronger than any desire for justice. But Daniel was safe, and that was what mattered most to James. The boy was given a new identity, a legal one this time, with a proper birth certificate that listed James as his guardian. They settled in a small town in Oregon, far from Idaho and the memories of the bunker. James got a job doing construction work, honest labor that let him sleep at night. And Daniel started going to school, learning to be around other kids, slowly figuring out how to be a normal child. It wasn't easy. Daniel struggled with social interactions, didn't understand jokes or games that other kids found intuitive. He had panic attacks in enclosed spaces and needed a nightlight because he was terrified of the dark. But he also had a brilliant mind, curious about everything and capable of absorbing information at an incredible rate. The scientists who had studied him had documented his intelligence but never bothered to nurture it. Now, with the freedom to learn about anything he wanted, Daniel thrived in ways the researchers never could have predicted. Years passed, and the story of the burning bunker and the rescued boy faded from public consciousness. The news cycle moved on to other scandals and tragedies, and most people forgot that it had ever happened. But in certain circles, among veterans and government whistleblowers, and people who paid attention to the stories that didn't quite add up, the tale persisted. James became something of a legend in those communities, the ordinary man who had risked everything to do the right thing. He never sought attention for what he had done, turning down interviews and refusing to write a book about his experiences. He said he had just been doing what anyone should have done, though most people knew that wasn't true. Most people would have looked the other way, convinced themselves it wasn't their problem, or been too scared of the consequences to act. Daniel grew into a remarkable young man. By the time he was a teenager, he had already graduated high school and earned a scholarship to college. He studied psychology and neuroscience, driven by a desire to understand what had been done to him and to help others who had experienced trauma. He never forgot where he came from, the underground room and the machines and the faces of the scientists who had treated him like an experiment. But he also refused to let that define him. He had been given a second chance at life, and he was determined to make the most of it. In his 20s, Daniel started speaking publicly about his experiences, carefully avoiding anything that might still be classified, but sharing enough to raise awareness about government overreach and the importance of ethical research practices. He worked with organizations that protected children's rights and advocated for transparency in scientific studies. And he always made sure to credit James, the man who had taught him what it meant to have someone care about you unconditionally. James attended Daniel's college graduation, his wedding, and eventually the birth of Daniel's own children. Watching the boy he had rescued become a husband and father, living a full and happy life, made everything James had sacrificed worth it. The nightmares about the burning bunker never completely went away, and he still had moments where he wondered what happened to the other programs, the other classified facilities that might still be out there. But he had saved one child, and that child had grown up to save others in his own way. The full truth about Project Clearwater and the network of programs it was connected to may never be known. Documents remain classified, and the people with the most knowledge have taken their secrets to the grave. But the story of James Wheeler and Daniel serves as a reminder that even in systems designed to hide the truth, individuals can make a difference. Sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is refuse to ignore what you know is wrong, even when every authority figure tells you to stay silent. The bunker in Idaho is long gone, filled in and covered over until no trace remains of what once existed there. The forest has reclaimed the land, and hikers pass by without knowing they are walking over a place where terrible things happened. But the memory persists in the people who know the story, passed down like folklore, but grounded in hard truth. Daniel, now middle-aged and a respected researcher in his own right, sometimes takes his children camping in forests like the one where he was born. He teaches them to appreciate the trees and the sky, the things he was denied for the first 6 years of his life, and he tells them stories about their grandfather James, the man who walked into fire to carry out a child that the world swore never existed. Those stories matter because they remind us that behind every classified program, every secret facility, every decision made in the name of national security, there are real people whose lives are affected. And sometimes, just sometimes, there are other real people willing to stand up and say that some lines should never be crossed, no matter what justification is offered. James Wheeler passed away in 2019 at the age of 64, surrounded by family, including Daniel and his grandchildren. His obituary mentioned that he was a veteran and a construction worker, a man who valued integrity and kindness. It didn't mention the bunker or the rescue or the congressional testimony. Those details remain obscure, known only to people who go looking for stories that don't fit the official narrative. But Daniel knows, and he makes sure his children know, that heroism isn't always loud or public. Sometimes it's a maintenance worker who hears a child crying in a place that isn't supposed to have children. Sometimes it's the decision to break rules that shouldn't exist in order to protect someone who can't protect themselves. And sometimes it's the quiet work of rebuilding a life, one day at a time, proving that even when powerful people try to erase your existence, the human spirit can survive and flourish. The story of the burning bunker and the boy who never existed reminds us to question what we're told, to pay attention to the inconsistencies and the gaps in official explanations. It reminds us that our government, like any human institution, is capable of both great good and terrible mistakes. And most importantly, it reminds us that we all have a choice when confronted with wrongdoing. We can look away, or we can be like James Wheeler, an ordinary person who became a hero simply by refusing to abandon a child in need. That legacy lives on in Daniel, in his children, and in everyone who hears this story and decides that compassion matters more than convenience, that truth matters more than secrecy, and that every child deserves to exist in the light rather than hidden away in the darkness of a forgotten bunker.